Hi, this is Peter Cowie. I believe that this will prove one of the most exciting DVDs that Criterion has issued. Why exactly? Because Sawdust and Tinsel, out of circulation for so long in anything other than miserable prints and tapes, reveals the genius of Ingmar Bergman a full 2 years prior to the great suite of films that established him as a major force in world cinema, namely Smiles of a Summer Night, The Seventh Seal, and Wild Strawberries. The credits already give a clue as to the clash within the film between a quaint, naïf attitude to life and the harsh realism of the relationships as expressed in the menacing chords of the music we hear behind these titles. In the spring of 1953, Bergman was 34 years of age. His career was hovering uneasily between failure and renown. He hadn't yet achieved international recognition, and in Sweden he was pretty much pigeonholed as a kind of angry young man of stage and screen, making acutely personal film dramas, none of which had set the box office on fire. Summer Interlude and Summer with Monica had confirmed his visual gifts and his almost uncannily sensitive direction of actresses. In a newspaper interview in September 1953, Bergman recalled that Sawdust and Tinsel was born last autumn when I suddenly saw this image in front of my eyes. It consisted of several circus carts appearing early one morning in late winter. In all its dreariness, the local landscape has a strangely demonic appearance that fascinates me. After working with the independent producer Lawrence Malmsted, Bergman seemed to be settling down at Svensk Film Industry, Sweden's largest studio, and one headed by an imaginative and efficient businessman named Carl Anders Dümling. But Dümling and his advisors didn't care for Bergman's outline for Sawdust and Tinsel. So he happened to show it to Rune Waldekrantz at the rival company of Sandrew Bauman. That was a stroke of luck, because Waldekrantz wasn't just a discriminating producer, but also a passionate film historian and an admirer of Bergman's early work. But the mogul Anders Sandrew reacted warily to the proposal and circulated Bergman's synopsis among various friends and advisors. His business partner, Shamil Bauman, returned it, saying he thought it one of the worst things he'd read. Waldekrantz, however, kept hammering away in meeting after meeting. He'd been production manager on Miss Julie 3 years earlier, and that film had scooped the Grand Prix at the Cannes Festival. So Waldekrantz felt that Sandrew Bauman should finance more films of this caliber to get Swedish cinema on the European map again. And Anders Sandrew finally gave a green light to the project, and by February of 1953, the cameras were rolling. Bergman often uses this kind of wailing sound, almost an abstract utterance. He does it, for example, when Antonius Block leaves the witch outside the church in The Seventh Seal, or when Agnes is succumbing to her terrible cancer in Cries and Whispers. Here we see Åke Grönberg. Grönberg was one of the stalwart journeyman actors in the Swedish cinema. He played Lars Ekborg's boss in Summer with Monica, and he would be Eva Dahlbeck's lover in A Lesson in Love. But it's here in Sawdust and Tinsel that he found the role of a lifetime. Unsympathetic, of course, yet also sympathetic in the same way as the tormented bull in the ring is somehow sympathetic. And here we have Harriet Andersson, who plays his mistress. She was, at the time, also Bergman's mistress. They had met on Summer with Monica the previous year, and Sawdust and Tinsel is certainly to a large degree built around her beauty and her allure. Almost immediately, Bergman communicates the physical difference between them. Anne, the young, slim-featured beauty, and the clumsy, corpulent figure of Albert Johansson. The photography on this film is intriguing because it marks the first time that Ingmar Bergman worked with Sven Nykvist, who would become his loyal collaborator between 1959 and 2004. It was quite by chance. Göran Strindberg, the cinematographer assigned to Sawdust and Tinsel, was suddenly summoned to Hollywood for a course in shooting with CinemaScope, which was just then coming into use. He had time to do some of the studio work, but Rune Waldekrantz recommended Sven Nykvist to a skeptical Bergman, who, according to Waldekrantz, subjected poor Sven to the most torturous of tests before agreeing to let him film the scenes in the big top, and we'll come back to that later. Yet another talented cameraman, Hilding Blad, was hired to shoot the exteriors and the opening flashback scene, which we'll see in a few moments. The title of the film is rather misleading. In Swedish, it's Gycklarnas afton, which is an old-fashioned way of saying evening of the clowns, or the clown's evening. But when it was released in the United States in 1956 by Times Film Corporation, it was called The Naked Night, because Bergman's films in the early to mid-50s were regarded in America as sexploitation pics that would do better at the box office if saddled with erotic titles. In Britain, it was called Sawdust and Tinsel, and that's the title that Criterion has elected to give this DVD release because it's more faithful, I think, to the spirit of Bergman's original. It suggests a circus. I think it suggests the tawdry atmosphere of the circus, the artifice of the circus. Now we'll come to this extraordinary flashback, which was photographed for Bergman by Hilding Blad on location in Simrishamn, a 14th century fishing village and seaside resort in the southernmost province of Skåne. It's probably the most imaginative sequence of Bergman's career up to this point, even if it has a look of pastiche about it. Pastiche of the German expressionist cinema of the silent era. Pastiche of Sergei Eisenstein's relentless galloping montage. And of course there's all this erotic symbolism, with the guns firing off as the woman flaunts her beauty in front of the soldiers. She's played by Gudrun Brost. When I talked to her back in 1979, she recalled this sequence. The sea was very cold in that part of the East Coast, she said. The clapper boy was ready with warm shawls to throw round us as we came out of the sea, which was freezing, and all the soldiers, who'd been roaring with laughter for the film itself, stopped laughing as they realized that we were suffering so much. In films like Strike and Battleship Potemkin, Eisenstein used close-ups in this way, almost like weapons. The lighting is deliberately exaggerated to communicate the hostile nature of sunlight. Bergman loathes sunshine and always has. He finds the harshness of the light unpleasant, and there's a glaring quality to these images that adds to the underlying current of vulgarity, savagery even. I wanted everything to be as white as possible, Bergman has said. Hard, dead and white, merciless in some way. Throughout the film, we'll find three fundamental themes emerging time and again. One, the role of sexual humiliation, which comes to the fore in this particular sequence. Two, the struggle between the subtle and the vulgar. The sly, sneering intellectual versus the physically powerful yet clumsy kind of person, which also surfaces in Bergman's ensuing film, A Lesson in Love, with Gunnar Björnstrand up against Åke Grönberg for the affections of a dazzling woman. And thirdly, the status of actors and circus people. Bergman had begun work at the Malmö Municipal Theatre in the fall of 1952, just a few months prior to starting the shoot of Sawdust and Tinsel, and he was already acutely aware of the power of the critics, and even more, the power of the audience, and the fact that you were only as good as your last production. And how cruel such observers could be in passing judgment on a nightly basis. And this becomes a significant theme in Sawdust and Tinsel, as we'll see. The clown is played by Anders Ek, who was a close friend of Ingmar Bergman's. He acted throughout his life on the stage with Bergman, but he appeared in comparatively few films. One of his most impressive performances on screen for Bergman was in The Ritual in 1969. But of course everyone will remember him as the ranting monk who harangues the flagellants in The Seventh Seal. In the 1970s, he was diagnosed with cancer, but continued to work. He was a pastor who delivers a homily over the bed of Harriet Andersson in cries and whispers. And he made an electrifying impact as the Colonel in Bergman's stage production of the Ghost Sonata. Note how Bergman suddenly interrupts the music. He does this so often and to great effect. And so he creates a tremendous nervous tension. He's ushered in the sound of the jeering soldiers, then silence again, and so Frost's humiliation begins. There's a double irony here, because while we're used to seeing a clown humiliated in the circus ring, we know that it's not for real. Here, suddenly, we recognize that Frost really is being disgraced. He's had to strip down to enter the water, and now, with his clothes taken, he must, like Sinbad with the Old Man of the Sea, bear his woman on his back. As he stumbles up the beach, over the jagged stones, there's clearly an allusion to Christ on the way to Calvary, bent beneath the burden of the cross. The total silence in such moments gives the sequence the feeling and the texture of a dream, a nightmare. The bleached look of the images enhances that feeling too. So does the drawn-out editing, carefully paced so as to set us, the audience, on edge. The music, which throughout the film has an ominous, almost violent impact on the visuals, was composed by Carl Birger Blomdahl. Now, Blomdahl was not your everyday film composer. In fact, he wrote the score for only one other film, and he was known in Scandinavia as one of the leaders of the modernist movement. He'd studied under the great Hilding Rosenberg, and he'd composed a striking opera called Aniara. He was an experimentalist to his fingertips, as is shown in his symphonies and concerti, as well as his considerable ballet music. Bergman loves music, and I think he'd probably admit that apart from film and theatre, music is the most important of the arts for him. He had attended concerts from a young age, and he knew Blomdahl's work well. Still, it was a challenge and a risk, and the gamble proved successful. Even in this early sequence, Blomdahl's use of the single drum hammers away, as though we were witnessing an execution. The use of prolonged close-ups is also striking here. While on the one hand, these images may hark back to Eisenstein and the silent era, they also point forward to Fellini and his similar close-ups in La Strada and 8½. So the clown and his woman are bound together in an image that could be a metaphor for Bergman's entire early period. It's a theme that joins Bergman's work with that of the playwright August Strindberg, who was a kind of spiritual mentor for the young filmmaker. Time and again in Strindberg's plays, men and women torment each other, suffer together, and realize that at the end of the day there is nothing to do but to suffer in tandem. Hell together is better than hell alone, as one lover says to the other in Thirst. The coachman who's telling this story was played by Erik Strandmark, who, said Bergman, was an actor with a real streak of genius in him. In The Seventh Seal, he played the actor who's eventually caught by death, sheltering in a tree. Strandmark was one of the rare actors who Bergman allowed to improvise and to introduce little bits of business into his scenes. Bergman has reiterated that this dream or flashback was the basis for the entire film. The dream is the theme, he maintains, then follows a series of variations. As we return to the coachman, droning on, we can deduce from the sky and from the sound of a cockerel that it is dawn, early dawn, as he is telling the story. Bergman even named one of his films Hour of the Wolf. He's always been fascinated by that hour before the dawn, when dreams are at their most vivid. It's also the time, he says, when most babies are born and most people die. And so this flashback dovetails, as it were, into the present, because both men are half asleep on the coach, and one can even imagine that they had been dreaming this whole sequence, both of them. Of course, one has to ask oneself why Sawdust and Tinsel has not been recognized for many years, or why indeed it was neglected when it first came out. 1953 was actually a good year for international cinema. In Japan, there was Mitsuguchi's Ugetsu and Ozu's Tokyo Story. In Europe, you had The Wages of Fear, you had Missy Hulot's Holiday, you had Fellini's I Vitelloni. It was a vintage year. But the new wave hadn't yet surfaced in France, nor had the critics who really would make that new wave. So Truffaut and Romer and Chabrol really began writing about films in the mid-50s in Cahiers du Cinéma and other magazines. They became the touchstone for a new approach to cinema, a more adventurous approach. So Sawdust and Tinsel in 1953 coincided with a kind of passing of the torch from one generation to another. A passing in terms of filmmaking from the generation of Marcel Carné, Carol Reed and, say, Frank Capra, to the generation of Roger Vadim, Jack Clayton and, say, Don Siegel. And, among critics, from the generation of James Agee in America, Roger Manville and Paul Rother in Britain, Georges Sadoul in France, to a new generation of younger, more aggressive critics who would pay more attention to the thematic drive of a film and the way in which it was made, rather than to its social or narrative importance. These two men are talking away in Danish, not Swedish, reminding us that this film unfolds in the very south of the country, and probably the circus owner has recruited some workers from across the strait in Denmark. As they assemble the big top, one thinks of the parallel between the teamwork involved in making a film and in theatre, and by extension, the circus. Everyone mucking in, everyone doing their own thing. Max von Sydow has recalled that when they were filming Shame on the island of Fårö, everyone had to climb up ladders and help Bergman pick the leaves off the trees because there were too many for that particular scene. This circus troupe has no home. It moves from one location to another, and the journey must begin at dawn if the big top's to be up in time for a performance in the next town on the itinerary. There's a relentless rhythm associated with the circus that appeals to Bergman because it's so very like the routine in a theatre. The show must go on whatever happens. Each hour has its appointed task.
Ingen har fått ut någon lön hittills. Det är dåligt med maten. I Askari fick vi lämna hälften av kostymerna.
This sequence illustrates the role of Albert as boss of the circus, even if the enterprise seems to be run on the most meagre of budgets. Everyone complains about the conditions. This scene, like a longer one we'll see shortly, was actually not included in previous American release prints. It's interesting because it shows the strength of the team spirit in Albert's circus. There's a lot of bickering, but at the end of the day, they're loyal to him. It's also a very good image of Bergman's own working methods. He's not so incompetent as Albert, and in fact, whether film or play, his scripts are prepared down to the most minute detail. He'll often call an actor and ask simply if he or she is ready to play a part, based on a one-sentence description of the character. And his actors have told me repeatedly that he never gives detailed instructions. Rather, he gives them hints, perceptive indications of what to do on the set. But, and this for me is the importance of this scene, he loves hanging out with his team, laughing and joking and exchanging stories and ideas with them. As a consequence, his crew and his cast were incredibly loyal through the years. Technicians like Gunnar Fischer and Sven Nykvist, actors like Max von Sydow, Liv Ullmann, Bibi Andersson, Harriet Andersson, or Gunnar Björnstrand. He made them famous, and they went abroad, often to Hollywood, but they would always come back when Bergman phoned them to work on a new production.
Sjöbergs sällskap lär gästa stan här. Och jag ska gå till honom och anhålla om att vi får låna några kostymer så vi kan hålla grann gala ikväll, va?
Ja, så bjuder direktionen på supé efter representationen med 4 Sawdust, brännvin, biff och chartoperi.
Harriet Andersson as Anne brings even to the brushing of the horse a palpable erotic charge, almost massaging the animal. If you're Swedish, you can tell from Harriet's accent that she comes from the southern neighborhoods of Stockholm.
Sminka det bästa du kan. Vi ska avlägga visit.
Hos landshövdingen, va?
Hos Sjöberg, min flicka lilla.
Teaterdirektör, du är inte klok.
Titta.
Bergman had discovered her, as I've said, for the lead role in Summer with Monica the previous year. She was, he wrote in his memoirs, a young actress playing at a Scala theatre revue in fishnet stockings and with an eloquent décolletage. During the location shooting of Summer with Monica, which was in a remote part of the archipelago outside Stockholm, Harriet and Bergman fell for each other, and Bergman left his third wife, Gun Grutt, as a result. By the time of Sawdust and Tinsel, Harriet and Ingmar were living together in an apartment in the quite fashionable area of Erikslust in Malmö, and Harriet would feature in many of the stage productions at Malmö Municipal Theatre. It was a relationship that both knew couldn't last that long. It was based on a powerful chemistry between them, rather than on any intellectual bond. Harriet remained friends with Bergman for many years, and even came back on 3 significant occasions, long after they'd broken up, to show solidarity with him and to appear in first Through a Glass Darkly in 1960, then Cries and Whispers in 1972, and finally Fanny and Alexander 10 years after that. She also featured in one of Bergman's later TV movies, The Blessed Ones, made in 1986, but rarely shown abroad. Bergman has said how much he liked Chaplin's film, The Circus, made in 1928. The concept of the circus, and more particularly the circus ring, is very suggestive. The idea of people trapped in a narrow space, physically and psychologically. The space for a conflict of some kind or another, as we'll see later in this film. So Albert, the circus owner, and Anne, his mistress, are dressed up proudly in all their finery, going on parade in the small provincial town. Their outfits are like masks adopted to impress the locals. The onlookers gawk at their studied vulgarity, while Blomdahl's music provides its own sardonic comment. The architecture here is very much that of Denmark, and the frontier area, as it were, although divided by water, is on both sides a blend of the two cultures, Swedish and Danish. Bergman has always known the southern part of his country better than the huge expanses of land north of Stockholm. He'd been artistic director at Helsingborg Theatre, not far from this location, then at Gothenburg on the southwest coast, and then from 1952 onwards at Malmö, the southernmost point, or almost, of Sweden.
Vill att du ska visa benen så var det ovilligt. Ja, jag överger det ju inte. Kommer han med skadliga förslag så slår jag honom på käften. Ska vi gå in?
Even this tiny community has its theatre.
Ett oskuldsfullt sinne, en kvinnas skönaste prydnad, skall komma er att övervinna all begärelse.
För förvissad, min fader, att edra barnens ord skola bära frukt i mitt hjärta.
Vår fru moder förstinnande önskar tala med vår herr fader.
Min herr make.
Madame, lämna oss älskliga barn och för ett kalender.
The voice we hear in the shadows is that of Gunnar Björnstrand, another old friend of Ingmar Bergman's, who acted for him in more than a dozen films, starting with the first film Bergman ever wrote, Torment, in 1944. Gunnar possessed this wonderfully authoritative voice, often rather high-pitched and dripping with disdain and derision.
Jag sa att direktören be dem fara änden i glödröda het.
Bergman shoots him from below, emphasizing his authority and dominance. It's a camera setup he had taken from the German and Soviet silent movies that had such an impact on him as a young man. Now the hapless Albert is starting to shed his brash assurance. It's a case of the biter bit, because Albert and Anne are now in the glare of the footlights. It's as though they were on the stage, at the mercy of an invisible audience, or indeed in the circus ring itself. The theatre is where Bergman belongs. It's a milieu in which he spent more time than most of us asleep in our beds. Curiously, though, he very rarely uses it as a location, so to speak. There's this scene, and there are the scenes in Fanny and Alexander. But here, Bergman is focusing primarily on the conflict, or rather the tension, between the performer and his audience. Björnstrand's arrogance in this sequence reflects that of the administrators and money men Bergman's had to deal with through the years, and especially during his youth, in order to obtain facilities for his craft. And Björnstrand will emphasize how the circus and the theatre are bound with umbilical ties. There's a lovely line in Smiles of a Summer Night when the old lady of the manor says haughtily, "The actors must sleep in the stables." In fact, an opinion poll as recently as the late 70s showed that for Swedes, acting came bottom in their list of favoured professions. But underneath all this dialogue, we can sense Bergman seething with anger. He suffered so much at the hands of both officials and critics in his early career. Many years later, he finally blew his top during a rehearsal one day and punched a prominent critic to the floor. He was taken to court and fined 5,000 Swedish crowns, but he paid up gladly. He's always looking, in his films especially, for ways to avenge his humiliation as an artist. For a while, Albert is in the role of the spectator once again, mocked by Björnstrand's Schuberg for his pretentious get-up.
Förlåt, direktören, men jag förstår inte.
Det är er styrka.
Jag menar kläderna.
Ni får låna dem, för utan ni behöver.
The way in which Schuberg gazes at Harriet Andersson reminds us that Sawdust and Tinsel was actually written during a period of some weeks when Bergman was very, very bitter with jealousy about his wife Gun Grut and about his relationship with Harriet. For her part, Harriet apparently went off to the beach with Erik Strandemark and his wife, leaving Bergman to write out his exasperation in the hotel room. Here comes the third major figure in the film, Franz, played by Hasse Ekman. That long, hard, mutual stare is a genuine coup de foudre, just as Michael Corleone stares at his beloved Apollonia in The Godfather when he sees her for the first time in Sicily. And the attraction between these two will dictate the pattern of the film to come. This is one of those virtuoso scenes in which Bergman uses a mirror to suggest the vanity and narcissism of the actor on the one hand, and the actor's almost naked vulnerability on the other. Hasse Ekman was part of Sweden's greatest acting dynasty. His father, Gösta Ekman, was the most glamorous leading man of stage and screen in Sweden during the first 3 decades of the 20th century. He starred opposite Ingrid Bergman in Intermezzo, for example. And the son of Hasse, also named Gösta Ekman, would start as an assistant with Bergman on films like Wild Strawberries, and then gradually become an excellent comedian and screen actor in his own right. Hasse Ekman was different to both his father and his son, in that he achieved considerable success as a screenwriter and screen director. There was a distinct rivalry between him and Bergman during the 1940s, especially as they both worked for a while with the independent producer Lawrence Malmsted. Ekman was 3 years older than Bergman, and he'd hit the ground running. He'd already directed 8 or 9 features by the time Bergman's first screenplay, Torment, was produced. First Division, a film with an Air Force setting, released in 1941, revealed Hasse Ekman not as a child of the theatre, as most had expected, but as a director who thought in cinematic terms and knew instinctively how to control the pace of a film. In many respects, Ekman was a complete auteur, but he somehow lacked the fierce dedication to his craft that marked out Bergman. He tried to cover too wide a diversity of themes and subjects, and so he failed to create a world of his own. One thing the two directors did share, however, was a remarkable grasp of the female psyche, and both were terrific directors of actresses on screen.
Så vill du desto vackrare. Glöm bort vad jag sa nyss. Jag ber dig. Du måste förlåta mig.
As an actor, Hasse Ekman could be extraordinarily vain, and so what Bergman did in Sawdust and Tinsel was to give him the part of a lifetime, enabling him to play out his vanity as an essential part of the character of Franz. These sex games have an authentically carnal feel, bordering on S&M. Harriet Andersson recalled recently that during that period, I quote, there was jealousy off camera. Ingmar was jealous, terribly pathologically jealous at times. He has been jealous of many people. He rented a room to write in, since we only had that tiny one-room flat on Greve Turagatan. This was when he thought there was something going on between me and a German photographer who came over to make a reportage. Looking at the film, I can easily transfer it to our own relationship. Albert and Albert's wife and children, and Anne, who was me. I didn't go as far as Anne did, however, because she went to bed with Franz. I was not unfaithful, even if he thought I was. I was bloody faithful, unquote. Now we come to a sequence that, for some reason, was cut in all previous editions of the film here in the US, on VHS, Laserdisc, and presumably in the original print released to theatres during the 50s. Why it was eliminated is anyone's guess, but the distributor may have needed to reduce the running time to fit a program schedule, and simply felt that this particular sequence didn't drive the narrative forward. In fact, it's a significant sequence in various ways. It establishes for once and for all when this is all taking place, presumably at the end of the 19th century or during the early years of the 20th. It presents us with an encounter between the circus troupe and its public. The circus troupe people seem to be having a great time. It's rare for Bergman to show us so many extras in an outdoor setting. He does so much later in The Serpent's Egg, but Bergman is a director who prefers to focus on individuals rather than crowds. And the spectators represent a cross-section of the kind of audience Bergman would have had at Malmö Municipal Theatre during the early 50s.
Vi gör bara lite reklam för våran...
Herre, har ni begärt tillstånd kanske, herre?
The arrival of the police is highly symbolic here. Bergman loathes figures of authority, whether they be judges, as in The Ritual, doctors, as in The Magician or Cries and Whispers, or soldiers, like the ones who we've seen humiliating Frost in this film. We mustn't forget that Bergman had done military service as a youth and suffered permanent damage to one ear after being forced to stand next to a machine gun during an army exercise. In 1976, Bergman had his own nightmarish clash with the authorities when two police officers barged into one of his rehearsals at the Royal Dramatic Theatre and arrested him for alleged tax evasion. They even seized his passport. That incident provoked Bergman to quit his native Sweden and live in Munich for 4 years. The cop seems almost a figure of fun, until he's unsheathed his sword and brandishes it like a Cossack from Battleship Potemkin. He seems bent on destroying these entertainers and, by extension, on stifling the artist who may become a threat to a well-ordered society. Back at the encampment, the mood is still very festive. Just living and playing together in close proximity, in a landscape dominated by sea and sky, seems to justify their whole existence and places them happily beyond the reach of the law. This argument between Harriet Andersson and Åke Grönberg also seems to smack of experience, with Anne frustrated by the shadow of Albert's wife that looms over their relationship, just as Harriet must have railed against the influence of Gun Grut in the early weeks of her affair with Bergman. Gun was a rather sophisticated, self-assured woman, someone who was forging her own career writing for newspapers and magazines. Harriet Andersson could offer Ingmar only her raw, innate talent as an actress.
Du säger inte emot mig, för du längtar också efter att få lägga upp. Du är ett kräk. Du börjar bli gammal och skraltig och du är rädd.
Jag kommer tillbaka till föreställningen.
Albert has hesitated about going back to see his wife or not. Bergman has written in his book Images about the gestation of Sawdust and Tinsel. I wrote the screenplay in a small hotel, he says. The room was narrow with a panoramic view of Stockholm at the bay. A winding, secret staircase connected the Södra Theater with the hotel itself. In the evenings I could hear music from the revue being performed below. At night, the actors and their strange guests partied in the hotel's dining room. I remember that the demons of retrospective jealousy were bridled and made to pull a loaded wagon. They were forced into productive activity. I wrote the film straight through, from beginning to end, without stopping to think, or add, or fill in. We mustn't forget that Bergman is an excellent writer, as his memoirs prove, and as his screenplays for films like Sunday's Children, or The Best Intentions, or Faithless, also demonstrate. With Sawdust and Tinsel, we're reaching the tail end of Bergman's Sturm und Drang period, in which his male and female characters are locked in a constant battle for some kind of supremacy. It wasn't until he reached his 50s that Bergman found a woman who seemed not to answer back in a quarrel. Ingrid von Rosen, who left Bergman a widower in 1994, could not have been more placid and was content to remain in Ingmar's shadow in the interests of their happiness. Albert is confronted unexpectedly by a boy one presumes to be his son, who doesn't recognize him. Bergman has admitted that he wasn't exactly the world's best father to his many children, and this is mirrored in Albert's awkwardness in the presence of the young boy in this scene. Grönberg was, recalls Bergman, first and foremost a comedy actor with an allegedly affable chubbiness. During the shoot, he was mostly wild and raging, since he had moved on to what, to him, was insecure and foreign ground. When, in one of his lighter moods, however, he would sing to us. Folk songs and favourite old pop tunes and obscene ditties. I loved and hated him. I imagine that he had similar feelings towards me." End quote. The boy is wearing the same sailor's uniform as Bergman himself wore in primary school in Stockholm during the 1920s. In fact, the boy's hair is even combed in the same style as the young Ingmar's was at the time.
Nej, nu kommer mor.
The actress who plays Albert's wife is Annika Tretov. She was a regular fixture in the casts of plays at Malmö Municipal Theatre. Like Gudrun Brost when young, or like Gertrud Fried, Annika Tretov gives off a perplexing blend of straight-laced propriety and the sexual allure of a professional dominer, someone before whom Albert seems humble and ill at ease. Bergman has written that the part of Albert's wife was based on Gun Grutt. He doesn't mean professionally, because Gun Grutt, as I've said, was a successful journalist, hardly a small shopkeeper in a provincial town. But I think he means psychologically, the blend of domestic goddess and sex object. Bergman has written that, quote, Albert Johansson, the circus owner, loves both Anne and his chaotic life in the circus. And yet he is strongly drawn towards the bourgeois security he had in life with his now abandoned wife.
Tycker du att det är varmt så kan du ta av dig rocken.
Det är bra som det är.
Ta av dig rocken nu så ska jag sy knappen åt dig.
The contrast between them is so telling.
Vad har du gjort av alla dina skjortor?
Albert's artificial cuffs dangling absurdly round his wrists. She immaculately groomed, perfectly poised. The makeup man, Nils Nittel, has accentuated the perspiration on Albert's face, whereas Annika Tretov's features are powdered with impeccable skill. She holds herself as Joan Crawford did in her middle period. The act of living becomes indeed an act.
Du ska alltid vara så känslig. Varför kan du inte ta saker och ting naturligt för en gångs skull?
This entire sequence constitutes one of the variations on the dreamlike flashback at the start of Sawdust and Tinsel. It's probably the closest to Bergman's own experience, at least where marriage is concerned. The mutual recriminations, the sudden switch from affection to loathing, from admiration to scorn. Bergman has known all these feelings during his many marriages. He wed 5 times, in fact, and he lived for varying lengthy spells with a further 3 women. Besides that, he had affairs with still more. Yet he can also put his own thoughts into the mouths of female characters. When Agda tells Albert in this scene that she was glad when they broke up, there's a sense of a clean break, something Bergman has always preferred. Cabby Larate, his 4th wife and an excellent concert pianist in her own right, told me that with Ingmar there's no pus in the wound. It's a clean cut. He tells you it's all over, and that's it. Period. Most men, she said, don't have the courage to do that, and so the wounds of separation fester for months on end. I only met 3 of those 5 Bergman wives, all of them evoking in some degree the bourgeois ideal that Agda seems to embody during this sequence. Ingmar's last wife, Ingrid, no relation to Ingrid Bergman, the actress, used to take care of all his correspondence, for example. And she did so with grace and discretion, never calling attention to herself at Ingmar's expense.
Men när du lämnade mig, då dog alltihopa nästan över en natt. Det var mycket egendomligt.
Jag gick inte ifrån dig. Du fortsätter med din affär och jag fortsätter att resa.
Vi skulle ju inte tala.
Nej. Du är så klar du. För mig är allt en enda röra.
Har det inte svårt?
We'll hear Agda saying to Albert that the peace and regular rhythm of the small town and the quiet street represent fulfillment to her, while to Albert he says they represent emptiness. Yet Bergman was repeatedly drawn back to such an atmosphere throughout his life. Just as he's quipped that the theatre is his wife and the cinema his mistress, so it's true that he needs a nest to which he can retreat in times of stress.
Ja, det är en stilla gata.
År ut och år in. Allt står still.
För mig är det mognad.
För mig är det tomhet.
Bergman dissolves from one woman to another, from wife to mistress. The Malmö Municipal Theatre, where Bergman was, as I've said, based during this period, had two stages. One was immense and was called the Big Boo by all who worked there, because you had to project your voice enormously to reach the entire audience. The other was a smaller, more intimate stage for chamber dramas of the Strindberg type. What we see here, though, is neither of these stages. It's a theatre in Gävle, north of Stockholm, used for shooting this particular sequence. So Hasse Ekman's Franz is revelling in his histrionics during a rehearsal for some kind of Hamlet-style tragedy that Bergman must have enjoyed writing. Lennart Olsson, who was his assistant for some of the Malmö years, recalled that Ingmar really taught Swedish actors to act in front of a camera. He really had an ear for the way of talking, unquote. Rehearsals were essential to his craft. It's an established fact that a Bergman stage production will run a specific length of time, and even when it travels to another country, the performance will never run more than a minute or so less or more than originally planned by Bergman. This scene also shows us that the character of Franz has no substance. He is an actor by profession, and in his private life he's an actor too, so that Anne will be convinced by his good looks and by his dramatic presence without realizing that actually there's nothing to it. In an interview in the late 1960s, Bergman agreed that Anne imagines actors as being part of the establishment, and then discovers it's all a lie. All of these gestures, all of these moments in rehearsal would have been second nature to Bergman because he was producing 2 or 3 plays a year in Malmö. It was a time when the theatre meant more to him than the cinema.
Alla på scenen! Alla på scenen!
Jaha, mina damer och herrar, repetitionen är slut.
Gunnar Björnstrand, as the director, becomes briefly Bergman's alter ego, uttering a few sardonic words, just as I'm sure Bergman did at the time too. During the editing process, said Olsson, when I interviewed him in 1979, Bergman was always thinking of how to back up the picture with the right sound for the imagery. Nearly always one single sound that gives that little extra to the atmosphere, the third dimension to the film. He was always very aware of that, said Olsson. And here the music of Carl Berger Blomdahl creeps in and gives the scene precisely the right ominous, foreboding tone. It's the most effective score, I think, for any Bergman film, with the possible exception of Persona. The green room, with all its masks and props, is similar to the attic in The Magician, or that curious storeroom filled with masks and puppets in Fanny and Alexander.
Jag vill inte vara kvar på cirkusen. Du skrattar åt mig.
Jag tycker att du är vacker.
And so their relationship is about to begin.
Du behöver inte alls
I don't know what it is that makes Bergman's scenes between men and women, the one-on-one scenes, so different to anyone else's. You can spend half a lifetime watching his films over and over again, and the mystery still seems to elude you. You wonder, does he create this intensity during rehearsal? It's as though neither actor is aware of the camera. And so they inhabit their roles completely, to a degree they never do with other directors. And as Leonard Olsen has said, Bergman was always searching for the right sound in a scene, so here we hear from time to time the circus music lingering in the background.
Luktar jag svett?
Det sa jag bara för att reta dig.
Min parfym är inte så fin, det är sant.
It reminds Anne that it will be difficult for her to escape from her world of sweat and cheap perfume into the exotic, luxurious world of France with its expensive scent and silk dressing gowns. There's a musky odour to this scene, verging on decadence and very reminiscent of the German cinema of the late 1920s, Pandora's Box, for example, or The Blue Angel.
Allting i våran vagn luktar stall, förstår du. Ska du sminka mig nu?
Vad ska du med smink?
In these intimate scenes, Bergman repeatedly places the man behind the woman, so that they're looking past the camera together and very rarely into each other's eyes.
Ingen spanjorska rider längre på hans spattiga hästar. Ingen ung dam i trikåer låter sig sågas mitt i tu av en full trollkarl. Jag är bara borta.
The physical rivalry between the sexes comes to the fore. Bergman was still excited and obsessed by the carnal appeal of Harriet Andersson, by the idea that she needed to be tamed, that she was a wild creature outside his normal orbit. He from a bourgeois family, she from a working-class background.
Utan sadel och bara hålla fast med meloren. Skulle du kunna det?
Nej, jag tror inte det.
Du är nog en svag stackare. Du har en mycket vacker kropp, men du tränar för lite. Du är lite fet.
Vet skäms.
Ska vi bryta arv? Jag lovar att jag är den starkare. Du äter alldeles för mycket.
So the arm wrestling becomes a metaphor for the psychological struggle and for the sexual attraction that each feels for the other. This composition is brilliant because it shows the unashamed nakedness of Anne's existence, the allure of her body, and the gleaming, silky texture of her flesh as captured by Sven Nykvist's good old Mitchell camera.
Jag vill inte. Kan du inte låta mig vara?
The shot of her back is worthy of Helmut Newton.
Ge mig nyckeln.
Once again, a familiar device of Bergman's, the mirror, which he had already used to good effect in Summer Interlude in 1950. It enables us to see both characters' full face, rather than if Bergman had been cross-cutting between them, so that there's no refuge for either one or the other.
Ge mig nyckeln.
Vi ska leka färdigt först, tycker du inte? Ser du den här amuletten?
Sven Nykvist must have had fun setting up this shot with the amulet dangling in the foreground. It's out of focus, so it obliges us to concentrate on the expressions of Anne and Franz in the background. It dangles tantalizingly, like some ideal just out of reach, tempting her. This could be the means of her escape from the sordid round of circus life. Anne is almost hypnotized by this bauble. And the way Franz makes it swing back and forth is indeed the ploy of the hypnotist.
Du lovar att ge mig nyckeln.
Jag lovar.
och aldrig berätta.
And in that moment, she makes her decision and starts to undress, starts to surrender. Once again, the faces will dissolve, floating, as Bergman once said, in and out of another, this time from mistress to wife. So Albert is rather enjoying this domestic bliss. His coat mended, his belly well fed, and a full glass of brandy on the sideboard to boot. In many ways, Åke Grönberg here, as he meets his second son, resembles very much the characters played in the 1920s by Emil Jannings, the great German star. Emil Jannings is known to most movie buffs for his portrayal of the unfortunate Professor Rat in The Blue Angel, opposite Marlene Dietrich. But his role as Boss Huller in E.A. Dupont's Variety, made in 1925 and set in a grungy world of acrobats and variety performers, may have influenced Bergman more. Variety was, in fact, the first film that Bergman acquired for his collection. He actually has a very large collection of films. He has his own cinema on the island of Fura off the east coast of Sweden, and even in his 80s continued to project at least one film each day. He's resisted the appeal of video and DVD. He's aware of the technology, but for him nothing replaces the magic of real celluloid passing through a projector. Now, Variety has close plot affinities with Sawdust and Tinsel, because Boss Huller leaves his wife and young son after falling for a sexy trapeze artist. Artinelli, a famous trapeze artist in his own right, seduces the girl and wrecks Huller's plans. So, plot-wise, Variety is almost a template for Bergman's film. In the late 60s, when asked about the issue, he admitted that, quote, Variety fascinated me so much that I consciously imitated it, end quote. Later, he recanted and denied the link. But I think probably the first comment is true, and that he was thinking of those German films, and of Variety in particular.
Jag skulle kunna sälja tältet och resten av kostymerna och en del av hästarna som är mina. Och det skulle jag kunna sätta in i affären, du.
Pratar så mycket du.
Ja, du säger ju ingenting.
Vad vill du att jag ska säga?
As so often in Bergman, after avoiding the eyes of her antagonist, she suddenly turns her gaze full on him like a searchlight, and utters that terrible truth, rather like Death in the Seventh Seal, who, when asked by the night if anyone escapes him, replies, ingen, nobody. Here, Annika Tretov says the same word, ingen. And the camera dollies into her face as if to emphasize the implacability and finality of that response. There's an identical moment, too, in Wild Strawberries, when Ewald tells his wife that his need is to be dead, absolutely, totally dead. The detachment between Anne and Franz is shown unequivocally in this composition. Again, no eye contact. It's been a business transaction. She snatches up the key and the amulet and will head straight for the jeweller's store. Carl Birger Blomdahl's music gives a rather pedestrian image a certain sinister quality, a feeling of apprehension. The script girl, Marianne Axelsson, was in charge of continuity for this film. Given the tiny budgets on which Bergman's early films were shot, it must have been difficult to remove all the other signs of modern life from a street like this, which I believe is in the town of Ystad, in the coastal province of Skåne. This is where Åke Grönberg very much resembles Jannings, in these close-ups registering his exasperation. Grönberg was actually perfect for this part. He wasn't anything other than a regular actor, as I said at the beginning of my commentary. But he was very versatile. He could take big, melodramatic roles full of bluster, and then apparently could come out on stage at the end of the performance and spontaneously sing folk songs and other popular melodies and have the audience roaring with laughter and enjoyment. Here's another wonderful interior composition lit by Nyqvist. The low ceiling of the caravan seems to press down on Anne and Albert. And of course the mirrors that Bergman places in both the caravan and in Franz's dressing room at the theatre obviate the need for conventional cross-cutting. They add a kind of density to the image, a look of abnormality, and reality becomes confused with its own reflections. Again, there's the absence of eye contact, but all the time something's flowing in this image, something flowing between them as they give vent to their suspicions.
Var har du varit?
Varför frågar du det?
Jag får inte fråga dig var du har varit.
Du låter så konstig i rösten.
Inte alls.
Jag har varit i stan och promenerat.
She's jealous of his encounter with his wife, and he's jealous of her meeting with Franz.
Vad har du själv haft för dig?
Det angår inte.
What I said earlier about the man always standing behind the woman in such duels is neatly reversed here.
Det var dig vi talade om.
Har du dåligt samvete?
Nej, jag tror att du har.
Varför skulle jag? Har man inte rätt att promenera nu heller och titta i butikerna?
Another thing that makes Sawdust and Tinsel so concentrated is that it takes place within a strict 24-hour time cycle. This was a formula that Bergman applied to all his major films of the 1950s. The Seventh Seal, Wild Strawberries, The Magician, The Virgin Spring. But in one important respect, Sawdust and Tinsel differs strikingly from Bergman's other major works of the 1950s. There's no mention of religion or faith in this film. The typical Bergman hero of the 40s had been the angry young man venting his fury against a crass and insensitive world dominated by figures of authority. 10 years later, his alter ego would be the heroic individual, towering over his world in the person of Max von Sydow, on at least 3 occasions anyway, questioning the meaning of life, the role of the church, and the accompanying emotions of guilt and forgiveness. In Sawdust and Tinsel, Bergman is distilling his personal anguish at the time of a marital breakup and an often acrimonious affair. And like all great artists, he has the courage to do so.
Jag var inne och tittade.
Du låg med honom.
Nej, jag svär.
No director achieves close-ups quite so well as Bergman. He has the courage to go really close in, but at the same time, his camera is quite mobile. It was only towards the end of his career, in Fanny and Alexander, for instance, that he resorted to the classical style. Here, he was still experimenting, still trying out various techniques to heighten the emotional intensity.
Du låg med honom för den där amuletten.
Nej.
Du såg att du dör.
Nej!
Skit du! Det hjälper inte. Det kommer ingen och hjälper ut.
Jag har inte bedragit dig! Jag har inte bedragit dig! Jag har inte!
Jag skulle kunna slå livet ur dig. Men jag gitter inte. Håll på din lögn om den roar dig.
Albert already looks exhausted in the knowledge that he cannot return to his family nest and knows he must endure the infidelities of his mistress. Like many Bergman characters of the period, he moves in a vicious circle, unable to break out of his existence. The line of the curtain dividing them is cleverly highlighted by Nyqvist, so that they seem to belong to 2 separate compositions, irrevocably divided.
Han hotar mig. Jag var rädd för honom. Jag vågar inte säga nej.
Säg någonting.
Vill du att jag ska säga att du ljuger?
And now Albert will utter one of the most Strindbergian phrases of the film, when, after she confesses to having slept with France, he tells her that we are stuck fast in hell.
För att du är trött på cirkusen och mig. Precis som jag är trött på cirkusen och dig.
Bli och skratta sådär!
Nu sitter vi allt fast, va? Alldeles in i helvete fast.
Anders Ek now appears in real time as opposed to his presence in the flashback at the start of the film. He has this lopsided, almost malformed face, the mouth often agape in a startled, often bitter expression. But he makes the mistake of giving the eye to Harriet Andersson there. And Albert brandishes his knife as if to emphasize his manhood, just as he'll produce a gun later in the scene. And we embark on one of those very long, very characteristically Scandinavian scenes when both characters, in their drunkenness, give vent to sentiments that might remain concealed. The clown may be wearing his makeup, but his anxiety is real enough, just as Albert's anguish is unmistakable. It's often said that Nordic people can only really relax when they've had a few drinks, and this underpins much of Strindberg's work as a playwright. That long, dark night of the soul, when the last bottle must be drained and the last truth must emerge. Interestingly, Bergman himself has never been keen on liquor, opting for milk and cookies where others might have beer and sandwiches. When he came to London in 1983 and we went out to supper after his appearance at the National Film Theatre, he actually consumed 2 beers, and his wife Ingrid whispered to me that she'd never seen him order a second prior to that evening.
Jag vill inte vara som en idiot längs landsvägarna med en lusecirkus. Jag vill sluta med cirkusen. Jag vill bli en hedlig medborgare med pengar på banken och en anständig hustru.
I said at the outset that sexual humiliation is one of the 3 fundamental themes of Sawdust and Tinsel. And this again comes directly from the Strindberg heritage.
Och jag kommer aldrig att gifta mig med dig.
Strindberg's greatest plays and stories revolved around the battle between the sexes, fought at a very basic carnal level, and it's something that the younger Bergman identified with, the concept of chemical attraction, keeping 2 people fettered to each other through years of wrangling.
Mina små pojkar. Och dig din jävel. Och din arma hustru. Det är synd att människorna måste leva på jorden.
That line of Albert's, "It's a pity people must live," is very reminiscent of the most famous of all Strindberg lines, and Bergman's favourite line. It's a pity about people, it's a pity about human beings. Det är synd om människor in Swedish. Sven Nykvist shot these interiors, and as Albert struggles in his misery, I can tell the story that I mentioned at the beginning about Sven Nykvist and Bergman. When the young cameraman was first recommended to Bergman, Bergman told him sternly to be in the studios at 6 a.m. precisely the next day to shoot some tests. Sven was living outside Stockholm at the time, so he had to cadge a room with a friend overnight, and he arrived right on time. Bergman marched in and fixed him with an intimidating stare. Now, Nykvist's father had been a missionary in Africa, and Sven had grown up there. And one of the lessons he'd learnt was that you should never lower your gaze in the presence of either animals or human beings, because if you did, it showed you were afraid. So he stared back at Bergman. After a while, Bergman took him out onto the studio stage, where he had to shoot a fairly simple camera movement involving exactly a scene with Grönberg and the pistol. Incidentally, this is a camera movement Bergman was very fond of during his earlier middle years, the dolly shot that almost lunges forward into a close-up on the speaker's face. The lines are flung out at the camera, at us, and never at the other person in the conversation. It makes for compelling cinema. Anyway, after that test of character, Bergman respected Sven Nykvist, and although they wouldn't work again for 6 years, the foundations have been laid for a lifelong friendship.
Jag är inte rädd för att dö.
Då tar du livet av dig.
Nej!
Nej!
Nej, det är varmt här inne.
Ja, vi måste ut!
Now comes a wonderfully expressive cut, because it's as though Frost and Albert have tumbled out of their dream into the real world, bursting out of the bubble of their discontent, as it were. Albert throws back his head with an exultant laugh, almost identical to that moment at the end of Smiles of a Summer Night when Fried salutes the dawn, saying, "Now the summer night smiles its second smile, for the clowns, the fools, the unredeemable." So the mood can change from one instant to another. And Albert lurches along, just like the bear that's been mentioned in the exchanges between Frost and his boss. And there is the bear, wandering around quite happily in the background. This banter between Frost and Albert would be revisited in an altogether more serious mood by Bergman in The Seventh Seal 3 years later, when the knight and the squire ride together. Frost is to some extent the squire to Albert's knight, Sancho Panza to his Don Quixote. And Frost, for all his antic wisdom, is but a distorted version of the circus owner who, as he said himself, is caught fast in hell.
Lilla människan, lilla nos, lilla barn. Varför skulle den förbannade slynan gå ifrån mig? Jag ska göra likadant.
Ja, har du spytt färdigt nu?
Blir du kall som en isstack?
Där ska vi rösa oss! Här, kom on!
This complex, very fluid camera movement, shot I think by Hilding Blad, has a bucolic look to it. The choreography, the costumes, and the all-pervasive tipsiness of the circus folk. At the turn of the century, when Sawdust and Tinsel takes place, there were apparently more than 50 circus troupes travelling through Sweden. When Bergman made his film in 1953, only 3 remained. Sawdust and Tinsel was shot over a 4-week period on location in a small resort called Arild. Bergman and the crew stayed in bed and breakfast establishments. Then everyone returned to Stockholm to shoot the interiors at the Sandrev studios. You can spot the sea in the background. It's an unusual, often turbulent stretch of sea called the Kattegat, dividing Denmark and the southwest area of Sweden. Bergman has an affection for dwarves, as those who've seen The Silence will remember. They seem to represent for him the grotesque, the pitiful distortion of the human condition, as well as being a symbol of the circus and its microcosmic view of life.
Jag tror jag går ifrån dem.
One struck immediately by the smallness of the circus ring, the intimacy of the setting, almost claustrophobic. And it will make the scenes of humiliation to follow even more difficult to bear for those involved. Bergman used to speak of how the audience in Malmö's Municipal Theatre could be as cruel as any critics, and the jeers and catcalls of the crowd suggest how vulnerable those who work in the performing arts really are. Especially this tiny band of circus folk, who clearly lacked the panache of a successful troupe. Bergman's use of symbols has often been commented on. Certainly he was still at a stage of his career when symbols appealed to him, and Sawdust and Tinsel is packed with them, from the single rose held by Frost here, representing purity, innocence, love, to the dwarf, to the bear, to the phallic gun, from the masks in the theatre to the amulet that seduced Anne into sleeping with Franz. And then, of course, the top hat of the ringmaster, the pomposity of his costume, his posture there in the background. By 21st century standards, it all seems very primitive. And yet just last month I was at a circus in Vevey, my small local town in Switzerland, and it was introduced by Eugene Chaplin, the son of Charlie Chaplin, who explained that this particular circus had lasted for 7 generations. And it was charming and imaginative, and relied very little on technology or pyrotechnics. Frost has left the ring, obviously still drunk, and greets still more people who are coming to see the show. There's an interesting story with the bear and poor Gudrun Brost, who told me in 1979 about her experiences on location. The bear, she said, came from Canada, and Ingmar made me put on these special stockings for my scenes with him. There was a scene not used in the actual film when the bear was in his cage and the crew brought his chain to me and lifted the bars of the cage, and I had a little piece of sugar in my mouth. I was incredibly nervous, and when the bear came right up close to me, I thought I was going to die. But he took the sugar so delicately from my lips. Then there was a point when the bear lumbered out among the extras, and I went flying like a piece of paper, and I couldn't hold the creature. The wrangler had a revolver, just in case." End quote. So Anne enters the ring astride one of the horses, and Franz probably remembers her telling him that she could grip a gelding tightly between those thighs of hers. And so he begins his lethal taunting of her, and, more particularly, Albert. It's clear that he seeks this confrontation. I've said that another of the themes of Sawdust and Tinsel is the concept of physical force confronting intellectual strength, and it's exemplified in this climactic scene where the men's jealousies get the better of them. But Franz is a smarter one, and Albert becomes the impulsive, blundering victim. Max von Sydow has pointed out that in many Bergman films there is a clash between these two kinds of personality. There is a very sensitive, highly emotional individual who cannot bear his own feelings, he's written. And he is usually destroyed by the second type of character, the one who's inhibited by his intellect, who's never had any real emotional experience and longs to be almost the victim of an emotional explosion just in order to feel something. End quote. Franz is obviously a little surprised by Albert's response, and he's humiliated in his turn when the whip sends his straw hat flying to the amusement of his current flame. The challenge is issued, and the duel can begin. And now Gunnar Björnstrand reappears. Gunnar Björnstrand, who, as a theatre director, has brought along his actors to watch the show, and who serves as an impromptu master of ceremonies, bringing to the task all the dignity that Albert should have had and has completely abandoned. Albert, though, suddenly relishes the chance at taking revenge on this mincing, smirking actor who has cuckolded him with such evident disdain. But immediately it's evident that Franz is going to topple him. A great cut to a remarkable composition as Albert lurches out of the right background while the clown's down-turned mouth symbolizes his predicament. Suddenly, the whole business becomes rather distasteful. We can see that the blows are not landing, and the staging is all rather crude. But as a result, the fight acquires a ritualistic tone, and the symbolic force of the struggle is clear. The fact that France has played dirty begins to swing the spectators' sympathies Albert's way. Now Albert is the helpless bull in the corrida, with France kicking dust in his face, blinding him. The parallel with Frost's humiliation on the beach is strengthened by Bergman's showing us the same soldiers gazing on in amusement from the ringside, the same soldiers who watched that incident with Alma some years earlier. Albert is being degraded in the eyes of Anne, in the eyes of Frost, his friend, and Franz is trying to show Anne and his girlfriend in the audience that he's the top dog. In the disdainful conduct of Franz and of Schuberg earlier in the day, Bergman reminds us of the confrontation between the stage and the circus ring, and how the theatre is so much more highly regarded than the circus, even if both demand their actors and acrobats to perform for a livelihood. No music here, just the shocked silence of the audience. Violence of this kind, theatrical though it appears, is very rare in Bergman's cinema. His violence usually takes a psychological form. The Virgin Spring contains something similar and even more repellent, the rape of the young maiden. And in Hour of the Wolf, there's a struggle on the seashore between Max von Sydow and a mysterious boy. In Shame, which may seem at first glance ostensibly a war film, most of the violence occurs off-screen. And Frost realizes that enough is enough and that Albert is finished. Dignity must be retained, even in the circus ring. The circus music comes in again, and Anne takes her revenge on France. Seeing her voluminous skirts reminds me to mention Margot, the costume designer who worked on this film and many others for Bergman. Margot, whose real name was Max Goldstein, fled from Nazi Germany during the 1930s, and his cousin happened to be best man at Bergman's wedding to Elsa Fischer in 1943. Ingmar's father, Pastor Erik Bergman, had helped Margot to find a home in Sweden. This is one of the most famous images from the film. There's a studied pity in the gaze that Anne casts on Albert, as if passing judgment in tranquility. Their roles are inverted. Now she is the one in control. He's been laid bare. And now Albert will seek release with his gun. Death and oblivion are what he seeks, and the bear, his animal counterpart, stirs in its cage, trapped and condemned, as he is trapped and condemned. Now the parallel is underlined between Albert and Anne and Frost and Alma, who also come together in this finale, just as the variations on a theme are brought together by a composer.
Albert! Öppna dörren, Albert!
His predicament is reminiscent of Bergman's after a succession of failures during the 1940s. And in 1979, when I interviewed him on the subject, producer Rune Valderkrantz said he had told Anders Sandrew, "You shouldn't expect to make any money on this picture, and the critics will be right if they judge it on commercial grounds. But you should see it in the long perspective, and then it will be of importance." and Bergman always finds such scenes as this to have an innate irony. In Smiles of a Summer Night, Gunnar Björnstrand's pompous lawyer finds that when he pulls the trigger during a game of Russian roulette, a blank explodes instead of a real bullet. And here, in the very scene that Bergman made Sven Nykvist shoot at dawn in the studio so long ago, in this wonderfully lit composition, Albert has the courage to pull the trigger. Pull the trigger and find that there's no cartridge in that particular chamber. So chance has condemned him to continue with life. Chance denies him an easy exit from pain and disgrace. And Bergman always remembers to puncture the bathos and the tension with a humorous line, as Frost asks naively if he's still alive. So Albert has no alternative but to survive physically. And thus now he destroys himself vicariously, as it were, by emptying bullets into the unfortunate bear. Also, by shooting the bear so dear to Alma, he's exacting vengeance for both himself and Frost on the women who have betrayed them. In some way, he has arrived at catharsis. And now the crisis is past. He realizes that he has lost the battle to retain that social respect that means so much to him. The ritual must continue. The big top must be struck. Chores must be attended to before the circus trundles off to its next engagement. There's a special tenderness in the way Albert embraces the horse, a tenderness he's never shown to either his wife or his mistress. In his childish sobbing lies for Bergman, as it did for Strindberg, all the sorrow of man's disillusionment with himself and with others. Again, it's shot in a naturalistic way. No music, no special effects. Just a pathetic human being lying in the straw with his horses. A creature almost, more than a human being. Albert is focused only on the necessities of surviving from a professional point of view, checking the horse's shoes and so on. Of course we go on, he says. Sawdust and Tinsel was very badly greeted in Sweden. One review in particular appalled Bergman. "I refuse to inspect the vomit that Ingmar Bergman has chosen to leave behind this time," wrote Sven Jan Hansen, "even if I can imagine that the menu was a good one to start with. I think you should make an effort not to soil yourself in public, even if you have a lot to get rid of." When the film opened in America, there was a particularly savage review in the New York Times, describing Bergman's film as, quote, "an offensive imitation of the worst aspects of cinematic expressionism," unquote. Some critics, however, such as the young John Simon, were bowled over by Sawdust and Tinsel. But it's never figured prominently in Bergman retrospectives, for the mundane reason that it's one of the few Bergman movies not controlled by Sven's film industry, who have been restoring his work and promoting it around the world over the past 40 years. This dream, told by Frost, who is now shorn of his makeup, his mask as the clown, and is now just another human creature, a fellow traveller for Albert. This dream forms a companion piece to the opening one, and the notion of returning to the womb as a tiny seed hints at Albert's own secret craving to returning to his wife and their comfortable, sheltered life together. And Frost returns to Alma, and Albert, seeing him going back, realizes, as does Anne here, that reconciliation is the only recipe for facing the future. Inadequate though they both are, they can help each other to survive in the semi-darkness of the world. As Alice cries in Strindberg's play, The Dance of Death, we're welded together and can't get free. Two young directors saw this film in Paris together in the mid-50s, Bertrand Tavernier and Volker Schlöndorff. The feature started in stark black and white, recalled Schlöndorff in 2007. I remember the camera tumbling over stones, up a beach towards a makeshift circus wagon. We'd never seen such an existentialist, heartbreaking, yet not in the least sentimental, but very poetic program. Leaving the Pagode Cinema, we walked back to school, making detours, having a hard time to readjust to normal life. And Jean-Luc Godard included Sawdust and Tinsel among his 10 best films for 1957. And I think this DVD shows why, shows that in a way, Sawdust and Tinsel is Bergman's masterpiece prior to The Seventh Seal, the greatest film of his early period.